Hello everybody, welcome to my videos on Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is an amazing book. I am so grateful to the person who first put this into my hands. I really hope that some of you have a similar response, that this is just a fantastic piece of literature. Janie is an amazing character, her story is wonderful, her attitude to life is wonderful, and I hope you all kind of fall in love with Zora Neale Hurston, who is also an absolutely wonderful human being, kind of larger than life in so many ways. And I mean, pick up her biography sometime. I have quite a good one here which I would recommend, which is by Robert Hemingway. Zora Neale Hurston, I mean, look at that hat. She has so many amazing hats. Just like go and Google her and look at all of her pictures and look at her fantastic style. The anecdotes that people tell about meeting her, and a lot of people didn't like her at the time. She was a remarkable and outspoken and defiant and just utterly herself. You know, she smoked and wore trousers, which weren't really things that women were expected to do, or certainly not, you know, polite woman, polite society. She wore these kind of wonderful African head wraps around her hair at a time when African American women weren't particularly engaging with their kind of their heritage in that way, and she was, you know, she was glorious, you know, unapologetic for who she was, and I think that is something that we can see in the character of Janie as well. So, as before, I'm going to be, as I did with kind of Grain of Wheat, I'm going to be breaking this up into a couple of small videos, so you can kind of focus in on the various different issues. And I'm going to be running these videos alongside the slides, which I have uploaded onto Moodle, so please do open up the slides, have them there, and I will be going chronologically. So I will sort of say, okay, now let's look at the next slide, and let's look at the next slide. So these are kind of meant to work together. So if you have a look at the slides just now, do pause and get them open if necessary. We have our title slide, and then our first kind of main slide is on Zora, with a couple of just like amazing pictures of her being amazing, because she's just very cool fashion icon. I love her. I'll try and not just gush about how much I love her. We'll do some literary criticism, I promise. We have her dates there: 1891 to 1980, and 1960. Sorry, excuse me. And a couple of her kind of major works there. Eyes Were Watching God, which we're talking about today, is 1937. I think one work that it's kind of worth particularly noting that's on there is the one at the top, which is Mules and Men from 1935. This isn't a work of fiction, it's a work of, I suppose, anthropology, social history, in which she records the stories, the folklore of, essentially of Black America. So Hurston has quite an interesting background in this book that we're reading today, in The Eyes Were Watching God. A lot of the action is set in Eatonville, which is actually where Zora grew up. If you flick on to the next slide there, you will see I've got a slide on Eatonville. It's in Orange County, Florida. This is her hometown. Her father was mayor, which is a very interesting thing if we consider Joe Starks becomes mayor. So Janie's husband in the novel becomes mayor. It is an all-black town. It was one of kind of the very early all-black towns in the US. Some really gorgeous paintings there from Jules Andre Smith, who went there and did a considerable number of paintings. But I think this situates her in an interesting place, in that she isn't coming from a segregated community, or even coming from a community where she isn't coming from a community where she feels like a second-class citizen. She is simply Black in a Black community, and I think that kind of is one of the things that sets her apart from so many of her contemporaries. So Mealbone was, not Mealbone, excuse me, Meals and Men was a collection, and she kind of started in Eatonville, but she did loads of works of anthropological studies where she just went and collected the stories, just went and talked to all the people that she could find. On one hand, recording a lot of things that a lot of other people at the time didn't consider worthy of study. She called them big lies. Kind of like the tall tales, which we actually see in Their Eyes Were Watching God. There's the kind of the guys who sit around outside the store have all these stories, particularly about the mule, and like, these are, like, what is the point of recording that? What is the point of putting that in this novel? It's not about Janie. It doesn't add to her personal journey. But what it does do is give us a flavor of this town and this place. It tells us who these people are. It tells us what they value, how they pass their time. And this idea of Black identity and writing about Black identity. I mentioned kind of she received a lot of criticism in her lifetime. She was not immediately kind of recognized as a great writer. We could kind of say she is adjacent to part of writing around, and was engaged by writers of the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of the great writers at that time, the people who were considered really striking, were male. And I think one of the reasons she didn't entirely get written into the canon of Black American writers is that she is female and is very much writing about female experience. Alice Walker, who writes The Color Purple, is one of the people who was really instrumental in bringing her legacy back, recovering her and saying, this is an amazing novelist. This is somebody who is telling important stories that we need to know about. But a lot of the writers at the time felt that she wasn't sufficiently engaging with the struggle of being Black in America. That she wasn't properly showing Black experience. People accused Their Eyes Were Watching God of romanticizing Black experience. And not giving sufficient care to one, the history, the struggles of the past of African Americans, and two, of the struggles of daily life. This is very much a novel of Black experience, but that Black experience is very isolated from any kind of interaction with white experience. And if you kind of go down from the slide on Eatonville here, I have a link to an article. I have this quote from her that I think is her kind of response to those people kind of saying, oh, you're not talking about the Black struggle. One of the kind of the major writers who was criticizing her of the not engaging with the Black struggle was Richard Wright, who writes Native Son, which is an absolutely painful, heartbreaking, brilliant novel about the difficulty of being Black and poor in America at this time. And Colored Me, which is an article by Hurston, is really interesting as a response. And if anybody is kind of particularly interested in looking at this discussion, I've got a whole bunch of articles I'd be very happy to hook you up with. But she says here, I am not tragically colored. She rejects that kind of notion that she needs to be engaging with the suffering and the negativity, and just says, no, I'm glorious, I'm fantastic. I don't feel like a second-class citizen. I'm not going to spend time writing about the feeling of a second-class citizen. She comes from a Black community. She talks in this article about kind of seeing white people pass through, and she was like, okay, they're white people, sure, whatever. And then she talks about kind of going into different communities and realizing the difference between black experience and white experience and kind of what that was, but she, you know, she kind of argues that she doesn't feel colored. That isn't part of her identity, that she is this as opposed to this. There's a fantastic quote I put up there. I feel most colors when I'm thrown against a sharp white background. So saying, yeah, if you take someone from one experience, throw them into another, yeah, they're going to stand out. They're going to be different. But she doesn't want that to be kind of, you know, that word tragically. I am not tragically colored. It is not a denial of race. It is not saying, you know, I'm not colored. I'm not come from this background. Of course she has, and she does engage with her roots, with her history, and I think that's really important, and I think that a lot of people missed. We're kind of just saying, oh, she's not even considering race. She is considering race, but she is rejecting this idea of a tragicness to her race. And this is interesting. We can compare with Janie's realization. I think there is a lot of Zora's life experience in this book. I don't think we can straight up read it as, I mean, we can't straight up read it as this is her life story, that Janie is just Zora and that's the end of the thing. No, but there is definitely a lot of her life experience that comes in here, and Janie has a realization as a child that she is colored, and she's looking at the photograph. She grows up amongst mostly white children, and, you know, is perfectly fine and having a lovely time and doesn't consider herself as different from them until she sees this photograph, and then she goes, oh, I'm colored. And it's a kind of, I suppose the point here that we're kind of coming across again and again is this notion of race is one that is, we are ourselves until we're told we're different. I think that's the kind of the major point that that Hurston's kind of putting across in this article. And do have a read of it there. There's a link on the slides, but I'll upload it onto Moodle as well. I'm gonna very quickly just open that up there because there's one section that I want to I just want to particularly highlight for you guys. Bear with me. Yeah, so if you kind of get this file open, have a look at the second column. There is that absolutely killer line. I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood who hold that nature somehow has given them a low-down, dirty deal and whose feelings are all hurt about it. She kind of says, you know, going on, following this paragraph through, slavery is 60 years in the past, the operation was successful and the patient is doing well, thank you. Now, obviously, loads of people would argue with that and sort of say, well, you're diminishing you know, the vast racism that absolutely still exists in America at the time that she is writing, and obviously we can kind of see still now. And I think that Zora's answer to that is, not to me. This is, oh gosh, dropped my camera. This is my experience. This is my story. I'm not going to change it to be the story that you want me to be. At certain times, I have no race. I am me, she says. So I think this is an interesting and not necessarily straightforward, acceptable, easy to take. You know, lots of people had genuine issue with this article, but it's really worth considering in kind of terms of understanding this novel and where she's coming from. Moving on to the next slide here, we have a little quote from Alice Walker. Again, just a link to a great resource is her own lecture on Zora Neale Hurston, and Alice Walker has written immensely on Hurston, and she talks about kind of this tragedy of this is the writer that she needed and she never had. She sort of talks about this wonderful discovery And she talks about where she is in her life and kind of searching, not really having an idea of the literature that she wants. And she notes, the year that Zora died, and I had no idea she had ever lived. And the great tragedy of this, Hurston is buried in an unmarked grave, which is a kind of mind-boggling fact, and in part that is due to her own pride, that she didn't tell anyone she was ill, she didn't tell anyone she was poor, she never wanted to ask anyone for help, and not that she was consistently poor, she had all kinds of interesting life of ups and downs, but she didn't ask any of her friends or family for help in her final months, but that nobody kind of sought her out and made that pilgrimage until Alice Walker came along, and there is now a plaque in the graveyard, and it's a very approximate positioning, but I'm just trying to see if I can actually find the exact quote that that Walker puts on the gravestone. I haven't got it right here, but it's sort of, she put this gravestone and kind of said, this is here lies Alice Walker, here lies Zora Neale Hurston, genius novelist, but it is approximate, and she was someone who was allowed to be forgotten for so many years. So let's do something about that. We're gonna launch in to look at the novel itself.